Everyone, welcome to another YouTube video. This one we're going to be going over how to paint Eldar Dire Avengers with no airbrush as always. So I hope it's helpful. Questions, queries, leave them in the comments below. If you do like the video, find it helpful, hit the like button. It means a huge amount. It makes a massive difference actually. And if you do want to see more from the channel, feel free to hit the subscribe button. But enough of my rambling, here we go. So the model has been primed with black primer, and then base coated over that black primer with Vallejo model color dark Prussian blue. The black primer is important because it gives the dark tone to the dark Prussian blue. If you put it over a grey or a white, this base coat will be much brighter than you can see on screen. So next up, what I'm painting right now, which is what you can see, I've sped up loads because it's just the base color. This is P3 Cygnar blue highlight. This is what gives us a nice color to our Dire Avenger. And the idea with this is I'm painting every armor panel. So every armor panel that is supposed to be blue is going to get this blue. All I'm going to do is all of the recesses I'm leaving as the dark Prussian blue. So this is what gives us our nice color tone to the Dire Avenger. And that dark Prussian blue is what's going to give us our shadow color. Now the paint is thinned down, not a huge amount because I don't want to have to do multiple layers. So the paint is thinned down to say 1 part water to maybe 2 parts paint. It's just thinned down enough so it's not going to leave big blobs of paint and then mess up all of the details, but it's thick enough to leave a nice opaque mark. So I only have to do 1 set of coverage because if this is an army paint, I don't want to have to do loads of layers of paint. Well, rather no more than I have to. Next up, what we're going to use is Vallejo model color sky blue, which is what I'm working with now. Vallejo model color is much more opaque, so it requires a little bit more thinning. So this is 1 part water to 1 part paint. And what I'm doing with this is I'm painting in my highlight shapes. Now the majority of the shapes on this model are actually cylindrical, so what you'll find is you're going to have lines of light that run down the arms, the shoulder pads, down the center of the torso, down the center of the legs. Now, I'm not worrying about doing this very smooth. So you'll see that I've got very harsh transitions from the P3 Cygnar blue to the Vallejo model color sky blue. The reason for that is because when we're working with blues, we always end up adding white to it to get that bright tone. The problem is the more white that we add to a paint, more of a pain in the backside that paint becomes. So if I start trying to get a really smooth transition with this Vallejo model color sky blue, because of the amount of white that it's got in it, it's harder to work with and it gets a much grainier, messy result. Now, that's not to say that you can't do it, but for the sake of speed, I don't want to really have to try and blend white or anything close to white. So what I'm actually doing is I'm putting down a solid layer of the Vallejo model color sky blue, and I'm doing this wherever I want my highlights, but I'm doing the highlights so they're slightly larger than I actually want, because what we're going to do is we're going to blend that out with the P3 Cygnar blue highlight, because that will behave much better. It will be easier to work with than the sky blue. But when we do that, it's going to make that sky blue darker and it's going to make those highlight areas smaller, but we'll get into that. So you can see that basically what I've got is these huge chunks of sky blue all over the armor panels. I've got like a line of highlight that runs down the center of the torso. I've got it that runs along the center of the shoulder pads. And I'm also going to have the same thing that's going to run down the center of the legs, with the exception of the knee pad, where we're going to have like this little cylindrical highlight towards the peak of the knee pads. And again, as I said, aiming for a nice opaque coverage. So we want a flat layer of this sky blue, and then when we blend it together, it will come out quite nice. Now, what I would probably say, I have this habit of, I paint with the tip of my brush quite a lot because I like texture and I like lots of marks, and I can easily hide that because I'm so used to painting that way. Appreciate with Eldar, generally people want a much smoother result. So the only thing that I would say to do differently to me is to use the side of your brush when you're doing your brush stroke. Because what happens is when you use the side of your brush, it leaves a larger mark, which means you do less brush strokes, which gives you a smoother result. Rather than if you do what I do, it's lots of little brush strokes, you get a bit of a rougher result. which ideally you don't necessarily want. The next thing to do is add the edge highlights. Now, it might seem a little bit crazy to add edge highlights when we're going to be smoothing over this anyway, but what happens is if you add some edge highlights and then when we blend and smooth it all together, those highlights will die down. What actually happens is those highlights turn into very subtle edge highlights and they add nice little details. So it can be nice to do that. It's an optional step. It's entirely up to you. You'll also see towards the bottom of the model, around the feet, the ankles and the lower legs, don't really end up having a very bright highlight. I don't even end up painting it that much because no one's really going to look at the bottom of the model. All anyone cares about is what they see on the tabletop, and that is going to be ultimately the head, the arms, the guns and the chest. No one really looks at the legs that much. So the further up the model we go, the more time you're spending on it. And you don't have to do that. It's all about how much time you want to commit to each model. But if you've got 10 of these to do, 20 of these to do, it can add up quite quickly, and things like that will save you a lot of time. Plus, with the amount of time that we've got to spend on the head, because having a white helmet means that the head needs to take a little bit longer. This is where you can save that time. You can see on that shield that we just painted, I've done a very quick wet blend between the dark Prussian blue, the P3 Cygnar blue, and the Vallejo model color sky blue. Because ultimately, by the time we put the edge highlights in and that sort of stuff, like the majority of that blend, we're not really going to see. Now, this is where I've jumped back to the P3 Cygnar blue highlight. Right, so this is our mid-tone, this is our Dire Avenger color, this is the actual color that we want for the Dire Avengers. So this I've thinned down to say 2 parts water to 1 part paint. So I want a transparent paint here. And what I'm going to do is my brush stroke starts in the bright areas on this model. So where I've painted the Vallejo model color sky blue on the model, where I've painted that highlight, we're going to start our brush stroke in that highlight. We're going to move it out to the dark area of the model. What this does is where you remove your paintbrush from the model, it leaves a big blob of paint. And we want to hide that. If you remove your brush in the highlight area, it will leave like a big blob of blue and it will look very messy. So we want to start in the bright area and we want to finish our brush stroke in the darker area of the paint. And the idea is we're just softening out that transition between that sky blue and that P3 Cygnar blue. And the thing is, because the Cygnar blue is the more dominant color, it won't take that many brush strokes to smooth it out. So in the paint down, work from the brightest and go into the darkest. Constantly jump around the model. Don't just blend one little bit. Don't do a brush stroke on one little piece of the armor and then wait for it to dry and then do it again. Keep jumping around the model. Work the shoulder pads, the legs, the arms, the torso, all in one go. As soon as you do a brush stroke on one arm, as soon as you do a bit of blending on one arm, while that paint is wet, move on to the other arm, move on to the torso. This maximizes your time. And it's why this paint job didn't actually take a huge amount of time. The thing you need to remember though is when it comes to army painting, the majority of people are not going to be looking at the details on the model. And I mean, you can spend as much time as you want on each model. If you want to spend 50 hours on a model for your army, then by all means, but that's not the point of this video. The majority of people are not really going to pick up your models and really have a good look at them. The majority of people are going to look at that model across the table and they're going to take a first impression and they're going to think it looks amazing and then they're going to move on. So what we actually need to do is spend the most amount of time on the most prominent parts of the model. So in the case of Dire Avengers, that's going to be your blue armor and your white helmet, more specifically the white helmet, because that's what stands out. So as long as you spend the majority of the time on your armor and your helmet, the rest of it doesn't really matter. And actually with this particular model, the rest of the model itself is not painted very well, or rather it's not painted very advanced. But you can see what I've done. I've smoothed out the armor panels, and that's purely with working with that Cygnar blue and working from the brightest area out to the darkest area. It's not perfect, but it does not need to be. Most people are not going to notice. The next thing that we want to do is we need to make sure that we frame the armor plates So the thing with Eldar is their armor plates are quite prominent and they have lots of, not necessarily sharp edges, but they have lots of shapes. So what we want to do is we want to put a edge highlight on all of the armor panels. This is really important because it brings readability, and that's incredibly important for painting in general, but more importantly for armor painting, because what happens is we're very lazy. We're naturally very lazy. So when we look at something, what happens is our brain just kind of, we glance at something and our brain tries to just make sense of what it is. So the reason why edge highlights are so important is because it helps the viewer's brain like just understand quickly what shapes they're looking at. And these edge highlights don't have to be extreme. They don't need to be like Tron style. They can be very subtle, but the idea is we just need to frame all of the shapes. We need to add readability to it. I know I harp on about this a lot on these videos, but it really is important. Games Workshop are a very good example of someone who does this really well. They go a little bit too extreme for me, for my personal taste. That's not to say they do it wrong. They just do it differently to how I would do it. They edge highlight every single shape. I personally don't bother. I just edge highlights the edges that are facing upwards, or if I feel like one of my shapes, like I can't really understand what I'm looking at from a glance. So I just do the ones that I need to, because the thing is, if I do every single edge for a start, I'm wasting loads of time. I don't need to spend all that time. Over a whole army, that's a huge amount of time that you can save. And it's not really required. So you can see like the bottom of those armor panels on the legs, I haven't really painted those too much. I've slapped on an edge highlight on the tops of them, and it kind of implies that there's an armor panel there, and that's it. So by adding just those two lines on the outside of those armor panels on the lower legs, it tells you that there's an edge there. It tells you that there's an armor panel there, but actually all it is one single brushstroke where I've painted a line. That's a huge amount of time to save when you've got to paint 30, 40, 50, 100 models for an army. And the other thing that I will say with Eldar is quite important. I feel like it's quite important anyway, because Eldar are quite a clean, crisp army. And when you've got nice edge highlights, it reinforces the idea that they're like, it's all quite well looked after. It looks very neat, very smooth, that sort of stuff. Now, that edge highlight was done with a mix of the P3 Cygnus blue and the sky blue. So the next part of this blue armor is entirely optional, because I think if you look at the armor as it stands right now, it looks quite nice. There's nothing really wrong with it. I think as an army, this would look quite good. So it's up to you whether you go to the next step. But ultimately, what we're going to do with the next step is we're going to go back to that sky blue, bearing in mind where we smoothed out the transition between the sky blue and the P3 Cygnar blue earlier. That would have made that sky blue that we put on the armor darker, right? It would have smoothed it out, but it also would have toned it down and made it darker. So what we can do now is we can once again go back with the Vallejo model color sky blue, and very carefully we can start adding more of that in and making the highlights pop more. And this is where the armor becomes a little bit more striking. As I said, it's entirely optional, but it's up to you whether you want to do it or not. I think it's worth it personally. Now, this is where I start. You can see I've got the sky blue on my brush. What I did first was I started pushing the little bright spots on the armor panels. Now, what I would say is if you're less experienced with this sort of thing, do the edge highlights first, because the edge highlights might be enough for you to get a result that you liked, and it's usually the safer bet. But it's entirely up to you. I knew that I wanted to push the brightness on these armor panels, so it's not really that much of a problem. Now, this paint, remember, the more white we have, the more the paint is a pain in the backside. So in this case, when I've thinned this sky blue down this time, because I want it to be subtle, I don't want big chunky marks. I want to keep the nice blends that I have. Thin this paint down quite a lot. This is like 4, maybe 5 parts water to 1 part paint. This is quite close to a glaze consistency. So the idea is I want a very transparent paint. And I'm just building up quite slowly, very, very small highlights. So I'm keeping the majority of that color that I've already painted, keeping the majority of the work I've already painted showing, and I'm building up very small areas with this sky blue. What happens is, because we keep the majority of the work that we've already done, it keeps that P3 Cygnar blue highlight tone. So we keep our nice blue armor tone. And because we've got all of that darker blue, it makes this highlight pop even more. If your highlights with this sky blue are too large, what ends up happening is we just end up changing the tone of the blue and it just looks like a bright blue, as opposed to a more like a magic blue, which is just quite shiny. Because that's kind of the result that we get. We get like a semi-shiny result on this. And again, it's up to you whether you want to take this next step. I think for me, when it comes to Eldar always look really good. My idea of Eldar rather is they've got quite shiny armor. That's just my opinion on it. It's up to you whether you do it or not. Now, what you will find, because this paint is thinned down so much and it's so transparent, is the more you build up those layers, the whiter and whiter it's going to get, and the brighter and brighter it's going to get. So you won't actually need a huge amount. It will be more about the more layers you add, the brighter it'll get. And then the last step for me, you can see that I've got white on the palette. Got a very thin down pure white, and I'm adding what is effectively some white dots to the brightest parts of these armor. So in this case, around the collarbone, around the shoulder pads, around the top of the, I've got no idea what it is, the lens thing at the back, and then like the knee pads, just to make it pop. But it really is like very small, like marks. It's tiny, tiny highlights. You want to keep the majority of the blue. Otherwise, the armor will just end up looking white, and you don't want that. You need to keep those really dark tones to the armor. So less is more. Now with the helmet, so you can see that I haven't had the helmet on the model. This is really, really important. Basically because, so first of all, the helmet is primed grey. That's because I don't want to have to build up white over a black base coat. Regardless of all the tricks that there are, this is about speed. I don't want to do that. So helmet is separate, I've primed it grey. Base plate is going to have a base coat of P3 ColourBlack, which is like this greeny black. It's really, really nice. And then all I've done is added a little bit of white to that P3 ColourBlack, and I've put an edge highlight underneath each eye lens and running down the curve of that armor panel on the front, and that's it. All I need for that armor panel on the face is to have a nice flat color to stand out against the white of the helmet, and to have those edge highlights to define the shape of it. No one's really going to be paying that much attention to that tiny faceplate. What they're going to be paying attention to is the white of the actual helmet itself, or the blue of the armor. So keeping in with that P3 ColourBlack tone, I've got the primed grey helmet, and this really is grey primer. So if you want to put colour in between, you can, but I've never really felt like it's needed. I've thinned down this P3 ColourBlack a lot. This is like 8 parts water to 1 part paint. This is like super glaze consistency here. So we're going really, really thin. And over the case, I think it took me like 6 layers of paint, gradually pushing that P3 ColourBlack into the darker areas. So in this case, for the helmet, I've put a shadow towards the top of the helmet. First of all, because it curves outwards, so that area would be in shadow. But there's a more basic reason for it. I want the face area, place closest to the faceplate, to be the brightest, which is where you can see me now painting pure white onto the front of this faceplate. 2 reasons for that. First of all, around the face we want to be the brightest part of the model. Straight away, if we have the face as the brightest part of the model, what happens is everyone looks at the brightest part of the model. Straight away, Dire Avengers, white helmet, everyone's going to look there. The second thing is because we've put that ColourBlack, which is almost like a black faceplate on there, it's going to make that white around it pop even more. So even if it didn't make sense for my light to have this area the brightest on the model, I would still do it because I want everyone to look at that point. So I built up the ColourBlack shadows towards the top of the helmet and towards the bottom of the faceplate, and then I painted on the white on the front of the faceplate. And then I've added in white edge highlights. That's it. So the ColourBlack took a little while, just because glazes take a while to dry if you're not experienced doing them. And then we've got that rough transition for the white on the front of the face. And then the colors in between is actually just the gray primer. Now the cloth is one of those things on armies where I really don't like spending a lot of time on them, because it can take ages to blend them, and frankly no one really looks at them. You just need something that's kind of rough. So the bottom half of this cloth, I've built up a white base coat. So this took 3 coats of white paint, which is what you can see. And then towards the top of the cloth, I've put P3 ColourBlack. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a really messy wet blend between these two colors. So what ends up happening is we have this really rough transition between this white and the ColourBlack, which is what you can see on screen at the moment. Now, the thing with this is, first of all, if you wanted to, we've got this rough transition, but if you wanted to, you could smooth it out with a few glazes, but we're going to end up hiding most of it. So while that wet blend dries, because the paint is quite thick when we wet blend, remember, I'm going to start painting the hair. The hair's got a base coat of white, painting in the black, I don't know what you call it, the black stripes on the hair. Now, I'm not even going to highlight the black. No one's even going to be really looking at those stripes massively. So all I'm going to do is put a black base coat on the white for the hair, and then I'm going to build up a couple of layers of P3 Cygnus Yellow, Cygnus Yellow into the white areas. The main reason we do the white is because if we put that yellow over the black, it's going to end up like green, but we'll get onto that in a second. So back to the fabric now that it's dry. What I'm going to do is paint in my edge highlights. This is a mix between the P3 ColourBlack and the Vallejo model color white. So it's given us like this greeny grey. All I'm going to do is paint on the outer edges and the upper edges on any of the folds. That's it. So what you'll find straight away is as you paint these little highlight lines, that dodgy blend that we put on this fabric, that blend will start to disappear. Not because it's not there, but it's because it's hidden by those sharp lines. So because we put those edge highlights in, it means that actually we don't have to spend so much time blending the fabric. And this is something that I find I wouldn't do it on a character model, because character models is where people really look up close and you want to spend a little bit more time on those. But when you've got 10, 20, 30 Dire Avengers to do, this is a very fast way of getting a nice result. And then the last bit is I'm just, with the Vallejo model color pure white, I'm putting some brighter edge highlights on, leaving some of the previous ones showing. This gives us lots of different values on the fabric. Gives us a fairly nice transition. It's nothing special, but it looks good. So this is what I was talking about with the Cygnus Yellow. I really like this yellow. I just think it's really nice yellow, but it's not going over on with more than one coat. Try not to go over the black, because what will end up happening is it will end up looking green on the black. But again, all I care about here is base coats. It takes 2 coats to go over it. I didn't thin this paint down because I just wasn't that bothered, but I would probably recommend you thin it a little bit so it doesn't obscure any of the details. If for whatever reason your paint is too thick, remember, all you got to do is wash your brush off and bring that brush back and pull the paint off of the model, right? So if you put thick paint on a model, it's fine as long as you just wipe it off before it dries. This is Reikland Flesh Tone Wash. You can see that I've slapped a massive blob all over the yellow, and then I dry my brush off. So I remove the Reikland Flesh Tone, dry my brush off, and then absorb some of that Flesh Tone Wash from GW off of the yellow. So we don't have these massive puddles, it just defines the shapes, and that's good enough. The last thing is painted the power weapon pink. If you want to see how I painted the power weapons, feel free to check out the videos on YouTube. There's 3 videos on how to paint power weapons, so feel free to have a look. The gold on this was scale 75 Victorian brass with GW Agrax Earthshade wash, so really nothing special at all. I didn't even bother doing any of the highlights. The gems were painted pink. I will do a video in future on gems, but I think that deserves its own video. So that'll be coming up on YouTube in the next couple of weeks. And lastly, the orbs on the blue armor were painted with the same color as the white helmet, and the orbs on the white helmet were painted the same color as the blue of the armor. I think I got that right. Well, you know what I mean. And that's pretty much it. So that's it. Another video done. I hope it's been clear. I hope it's been helpful. Thank you everyone for the support. It means a huge amount. And if you do want to support, as always, feel free to check out the Patreon. The Patreon's got options on there for one-to-one tuition if you guys do want to improve, or if you're just interested in video content, there is far more advanced and in-depth video content on the Patreon for display stuff and competition pieces and that sort of stuff. But regardless of that, thank you everyone for hanging about, and I'll catch you later.